Let's skip the pleasantries. China didn't warn, it didn't blink, it banned. 16 US companies blacked out overnight, not suspended, not delayed, banned. No quiet backroom whispers, no review pending loopholes. Beijing pulled the plug in broad daylight, and the West barely flinched. But that silence, it's not calm. It's the quiet that comes right before the sirens. Because while you were watching TikToks and interest rate debates, China just carved out a new red line. And this time, it's not just symbolic. It's strategic. It's surgical. And it's real. But why now? And why these exact 16 firms? That's what we're about to unpack. On April 4th, 2025, just 72 hours after President Trump authorized a new wave of tariffs on $88 billion worth of Chinese imports, Beijing released its counterstrike, a ban on 16 major U.S. firms, many tied to military hardware, AI, surveillance, and Taiwan arms deals. The timing wasn't impulsive. It was coordinated. According to a Bloomberg intelligence report released the same day, China's Ministry of Commerce had finalized the blacklist weeks earlier, but waited for a clear political trigger. That trigger came with Washington's decision to escalate trade tensions during a fragile global market recovery. With U.S. GDP growth slowing to 1.1% in Q4 2024 and consumer sentiment dipping for the third consecutive quarter, Beijing likely calculated that Washington had little economic bandwidth left to absorb another hit. In the words of Wang Huyao, founder of the Center for China and Globalization, China is no longer responding for symbolism. This was economic deterrence, calculated and precise. But what's more revealing isn't just who was banned, it's why they were selected. These companies aren't just random defense contractors. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon Technologies, and General Atomics, all blacklisted, accounted for over $7.9 billion in arms sales to Taiwan between 2020 and 2024, according to SIPRI and Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense. Alongside them, AI firms like Palantir, defense chip makers like Lattice Semiconductor, and precision drone manufacturers such as AeroVironment were also cut off. This is Beijing building a legal wall between its markets and the core of the U.S. military-industrial ecosystem. The move signals a shift from reactive retaliation to offensive containment, severing financial oxygen from any American company involved in what Beijing deems sovereign violations. But this isn't just a message to Washington. It's a warning to firms worldwide that operating in gray zones like Taiwan could carry real economic costs. And it forces a bigger question. If China's strategy is to make American security contracts unprofitable, how far will it go to enforce that? The United States arms deal signed with Taiwan in February 2025, valued at $4.2 billion, wasn't just large. It was provocative. The package included 400 long-range precision missiles, 24 MQ-9 Reaper drones, and early warning radar systems, many of which had never previously been exported to Taipei. That's where it crossed Beijing's red line. According to Xinhua, the ban was directly tied to these sales, and China's defense ministry accused the United States of sabotaging the One China principle under the pretense of defensive support. But the choice to target defense and tech firms rather than commodities or tariffs marks a deeper shift. Beijing isn't punishing volume, it's punishing capability. This is about slowing Taiwan's access to systems that would tilt the military balance in the Taiwan Strait. And the United States' response, so far, muted. But the lack of immediate retaliation may speak less to strategy and more to uncertainty. As the Wall Street Journal's Ling Wei noted, the White House is cautious because it doesn't know how much further China is willing to go and which American sectors are next. That uncertainty is precisely what gives Beijing leverage. But China isn't just mimicking past sanctions, it's repurposing Washington's own tools. The irony is unavoidable. Since 2018, the United States has sanctioned or restricted over 280 Chinese entities, from Huawei and ZTE to YMTC and SMIC. These actions, often justified under national security, were aimed at curbing China's access to advanced tech. But in blacklisting these 16 U.S. firms, Beijing is effectively reversing the script. And unlike early Chinese countermeasures, mainly symbolic tariffs, this move leverages America's model of extraterritorial punishment. China's export control law, passed in late 2020 but rarely used, has now been applied with surgical precision. The law grants the state sweeping authority to ban companies whose actions harm China's sovereignty or security. This legal symmetry is no coincidence. As Georgetown University's Professor James Riley puts it, China has studied the mechanics of U.S. sanctions and has decided to fight fire with architecture, not outrage. The message is clear. Economic tools are now mutual, not unilateral. But while the legality may echo U.S. strategy, the reaction exposes a contradiction buried in Western responses. When the United States blocked Huawei from accessing American chips in 2019, the move was branded as necessary containment. When China bans Raytheon over arms deals, it's called hostile coercion. The semantic imbalance is consistent across Western outlets. A Reuters analysis of 1,200 sanctions-related headlines from 2021 to 2024 found that 89% of U.S. measures were framed in security terms, while 76% of Chinese responses were labeled as aggression or retaliation. This discrepancy matters, not because it proves hypocrisy, but because it reflects narrative asymmetry. Western democracies often see their actions as defense of rules-based order. But to Beijing, those rules look increasingly selective. In fact, the Center for Strategic and International Studies noted in a March 2025 report that U.S. sanctions policy is increasingly viewed abroad as a geopolitical tool rather than a neutral enforcement mechanism. This is reshaping how global South countries interpret trade law. While Washington calls China's blacklist economic warfare, Brazil, South Africa, and the UAE have issued no condemnation, and several are pursuing similar tools domestically. The core dilemma is this: if sanctions are valid instruments of statecraft, then doesn't China have the same right to wield them? And if not, what principle is the West really defending? The direct financial hit from China's ban may appear minimal. U.S. defense contractors have little exposure to mainland Chinese contracts, but the secondary impacts could prove destabilizing. Many of the blacklisted firms, including Lattice Semiconductor and Teledyne Technologies, rely on rare earth materials and specialty components sourced from Chinese-controlled supply chains. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, China produced 70% of the world's rare earth elements in 2023 and refined over 87%, including critical inputs for military-grade sensors and aerospace electronics. A March 2025 report from the RAND Corporation warned that even a 30-day disruption in these supply lines could delay U.S. defense procurement schedules by up to 11 months. General Atomics, a key drone supplier to the Pentagon, has already begun rerouting its gallium sourcing through Australia, raising costs by 18%, per company filings reviewed by Bloomberg. The economic cost isn't just theoretical. It's already inflating procurement budgets and threatening production timelines. And the deeper risk: China hasn't yet banned exports of those materials. But it now holds that option like a loaded weapon, uncapped, untriggered, but unmistakably visible. China's blacklist didn't materialize in a vacuum. It was incubated in the shadow of Trump's original trade war. Between 2018 and 2020, the United States imposed tariffs on over $360 billion in Chinese goods, triggering a retaliatory cycle that saw China place counter duties on U.S. agricultural exports. But beyond soybeans and steel, the real outcome was strategic recalibration. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, by 2024, China had reduced its exposure to U.S. imports in advanced manufacturing by 38% and boosted domestic semiconductor R&D spending to $44.3 billion, a 62% increase from pre-trade war levels. In effect, Washington's attempt to isolate Beijing economically catalyzed its tech self-sufficiency agenda. The tariffs hurt China in the short term, said Nicholas Lardy, senior fellow at PIIE. But they taught Beijing that survival means independence. The blacklist is not a reaction, it's a culmination, a delayed counterpunch thrown after years of forced adaptation. And with BRICS and regional trade partners increasingly aligned with China's industrial ambitions, the blowback is no longer bilateral. It's systemic. Support for China's approach isn't just coming from behind closed doors. It's showing up in trade statistics and institutional alignment. The IMF reported in its February 2025 World Economic Outlook that intra-BRICS trade surged 21% year over year, surpassing $1.9 trillion, while China settled over 41% of its cross-border trade in yuan by Q1 2025, up from just 19% 2 years prior. More strikingly, nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have begun pricing long-term energy contracts in yuan, breaking with the US dollar standard for the first time since the 1970s. In March, Egypt's Suez Canal Authority announced a yuan-denominated toll payment option, a move publicly welcomed by Beijing. These aren't symbolic gestures. They represent a shift in alignment. Former IMF chief economist Kenneth Rogoff commented in the Financial Times that global markets are signaling that the unipolar dollar order is weakening, and China's strategic assertiveness is part of that evolution. The longer US firms are sidelined and allies remain quiet, the clearer it becomes. The blacklist isn't an outlier. It's a blueprint others are now studying. The blacklist is just one tile in a larger geopolitical mosaic China has been assembling since at least 2015. From the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative to the creation of the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, Beijing has been building parallel institutions that sidestep Western control. And it's working. In January 2025, the BRICS bloc, now including Egypt, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, officially overtook the G7 in global GDP at purchasing power parity, reaching 34.2% compared to the G7's 29.8%, according to IMF data. China's digital yuan is now in active use in pilot programs across 28 countries, while CIPS processed over $12 trillion in transactions last year, nearly doubling its 2022 total per the People's Bank of China. Meanwhile, US-led institutions like SWIFT and the World Bank face increasing resistance from the global south. This isn't an economic coup. It's a slow, silent rewiring of who holds the keys and who writes the code for the next financial century. What began as trade retaliation has morphed into institutional transformation. And if the blacklist was the warning shot, the next move may target the very plumbing of global finance itself. But if you think this was the final move, think again. What if this blacklist was never the main event, but just a decoy to measure Western reaction? Multiple senior sources cited by Bloomberg and Nikkei Asia suggest China is preparing a wider strategy that includes potential export bans on neodymium and dysprosium, rare earths essential to everything from F-35 jets to Tesla engines. Simultaneously, state banks are reportedly conducting scenario modeling for a future where all dollar transactions are phased out of strategic sectors. And here's the stinger: Reuters reported that China's central bank reduced its U.S. Treasury holdings by $29.3 billion in Q1 2025 alone. The sharpest quarterly cut since 2016. That's not de-risking. That's de-dollarizing. So ask yourself this. If Beijing is willing to blacklist Lockheed Martin without blinking, what happens when the next move isn't a list, but a full-scale rupture? Drop your take in the comments. Is this a controlled escalation or the start of a long, quiet decoupling? We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.